Welcome and good morning. I am Josh Coyote, today's worship associate. Today is our October 11th online service. Reverend Kevin Carson, Daniel Schwen, and I bring you this service from the church's sanctuary. So welcome this morning, this day, and this opportunity to be together in virtual community. Our weekly announcements are: first, we would like everyone to please sign into the chat box to the right of your screen. This will let us know who is joining us. We will be having sorrows, concerns, and joys, but that will happen after the sermon. That will happen after Time for All Ages. At that time, we'll read those that came in earlier by email, and I also invite you to post any other sorrows, concerns, or joys into the chat box. They will be read and a candle lit. When you share one in the chat box, please indicate if it's a sorrow, concern, or joy. Reverend Kevin Carson is beginning to have some office hours. If you would like to meet him, please email or call him ahead of time. The Philosophical Society meeting will be online on October 15th, continuing our election discussion. Women's Study Group will be meeting on Zoom next Sunday, October 18th at 12:30 p.m. to discuss women in religion and history. Contact Elizabeth Coyote, DREE, at idahofallsuu.org for the link. The youth group will be meeting next Sunday at October 18th at 9:30 a.m. Please contact Elizabeth Coyote at DREE at idahofallsuu.org for the link and for more information. There's a Habitat for Humanity fundraiser. Instead of their usual meeting, they will be doing it online, having an online auction next week on Thursday and Friday. Before we get started, we also need to mention how we stay afloat. There are several ways you can do this. There is a photo of our website showing how you can make your offering. You can go to our church website and click on the Give button in the upper right-hand corner between Search and Contact. When you click on this button, you can pay via PayPal. There's also, you are welcome to send in donations by check to our church's P.O. Box number, which is also on the website. And finally, our president, Daniel Schwen, will have an announcement.
Good morning. So we have one more important announcement from the board. In the past years, our church has been barely skirting by financially. In some years, we ran a deficit. Many years, as you surely remember, we desperately asked members to increase their pledge during the annual meeting. We had barely any financial cushion to speak of, and a few years ago, I was treasurer back then, our checking account was temporarily running so low, I was concerned about paying the staff. Earlier this year, our church received an anonymous donation of $300,000, which we are extremely excited about and grateful for. In light of our past experiences, the board strongly recommends to treat this donation like an endowment, capping the annual spending of the funds at 4%. We have a chance here to start to secure the long-term future of this congregation, and that means we still rely on your pledges to cover the ongoing operational costs. In the next few weeks, we will start our annual pledge drive, and while we won't have the proverbial gun of imminent financial doom to our heads anymore, we hope we can count on your generosity to make this wonderful gift last as long as possible. Thank you.
We will now move into the sacred time of worship. As I ring the peace bowl 3 times, take deep breaths and relax so we can move into worship. For this moment in time, let go of your anxieties, fears, and worries. Be in this moment. We will now begin our service with our prelude. Since we are not all together, I will read our church covenant for us all. It is also printed in the order of service if you feel like reading along with me. Love is the spirit of this community, and service its law. This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another. We will now be lighting our chalice. If you have a candle or chalice available, feel free to light yours along with me. May the light we now kindle inspire us to use our powers, to heal and not to harm, to help and not to hinder, to bless and not to curse, to serve you, Spirit of freedom.
Good morning. Our call to worship this morning comes from the holy man Black Elk of the Oglala Lakota Nation. Then I was standing on the highest mountain of them all, and around about beneath me was the whole hoop of the world. And while I stood there, I saw more than I can tell, and I understood more than I saw, for I was seeing in a sacred manner, the shapes of all things in the Spirit, and the shape of all shapes as they must live together like one being. And I saw the sacred hoop of my people was one of the many hoops that made one circle, wide as daylight and as starlight. And in the center grew one mighty flowering tree to shelter all the children of one mother and one father. And I saw that it was holy, but anywhere is the center of the world. I invite you to join now in singing our opening hymn, number 360, Here We Have Gathered.
This is a special time in our congregation where each of us has an opportunity to share major events in our lives, our joys, our concerns, and our sorrows, so they all can be uplifted by our UU community. So Reverend Kevin Carson will light the candles, and I will read them, the ones that have come in by email. Victoria McDonald shares a joy that Honey has had her second ACL surgery, and she is healing nicely, and she hopes not to have to limp next time she comes to visit the UU church. Devette Bogart has a joy seeing how happy her mother, Joyce Chambers, is while spending time in Washington State with her granddaughter, who is expecting her first great-grandchild, David, the namesake of her husband and her deceased grandson. And we have a sorrow from Larry and Nancy Frank. They are sad to see the growing lack of civility. You're hearing this from the local area, upstate New York, Boston, Kansas City, and Salt Lake City, and they fear that it doesn't bode well for the future. And are there any others? Okay. We light one more candle for all those sorrows, concerns, and joys we hold in our hearts and are not ready to share at this time. Know that we lift up our love for you, and we are all in this together.
Our reading this morning is an excerpt from the book The Southeastern Indians by Charles Hudson. When Christopher Columbus set foot on the shores of the New World, paving the way for European adventurers to invade and colonize the Americas, the consequences proved great for both the Europeans and the native people of the New World. Never in the history of the world have cultures so different and so unprepared for each other come into such ineluctable collision. On one side were the Europeans, with a centuries-old literate tradition behind them, able to accumulate massive quantities of knowledge and to disseminate it through the printed word, to create complex social organizations with precisely specified tasks, and to plan complicated social strategies far into the future. On the other side were the Indians, relying on delicately structured oral traditions, living out their lives in tautly organized social structures, and making their livings in balanced ecological systems worked out over centuries of intensive experience within their home territories. The American Indians and their homeland were so new to the Europeans, so outside the realm of their best knowledge, that it took over 1.5 centuries for anything approaching a full realization of the new reality to sink in. Africa and Asia were poorly known to the Europeans, but they were not new. And when new knowledge of Africa or Asia began reaching Europe, it did not challenge the fundamental assumptions in the European worldview. But there was too much in the New World to comprehend. The information from the New World seemed weird, unbelievable, irrelevant. It could not be accommodated in familiar categories of understanding. In many ways, the European mind was closed against experience. To a surprising degree, the first Europeans in the New World saw what they expected to see. I invite you to join in singing our next hymn, number 21, For the Beauty of the Earth. On October 12, 1892, Americans celebrated the first official Columbus Day holiday, as a one-time event declared by President Benjamin Harrison to commemorate the 400th anniversary of the arrival of Columbus in the New World. Though some East Coast cities had been celebrating the day since at least 1792, gaining federal recognition for the occasion was a source of great pride among the Italian Americans, who were often subjected to the denigration and abuse commonly aimed at the most recent immigrants to America's shores. Indeed, with their foreign language and Catholic faith, many Italian Americans seemed to receive an extra measure of derision. Only a year earlier, a lynch mob in New Orleans had murdered 11 Italian immigrants, and President Harrison's declaration was, in part, an attempt to ease strained relations with the Italian government in the aftermath of the widely publicized event. Finally, in 1934, after years of lobbying by Italian-American politicians and the Catholic men's group the Knights of Columbus, Columbus Day became an annual federal holiday. In many cities that have significant Italian-American communities, Columbus Day remains a festive occasion marked by parades and street festivals. From my time living in New England, I discovered this is certainly the case in Providence, Rhode Island, in the Federal Hill neighborhood near downtown. There, the main thoroughfare, Atwell's Avenue, is striped down the middle with the red, white, and green colors of the Italian flag. The annual parade follows the route beginning at De Pasquale Square near the Pina, or pine cone gateway arch, which is an ancient Roman symbol of vitality, and continues past the many fine Italian restaurants, grocers, and shops in the neighborhood along the way. Marching bands from area high schools and groups from local organizations march in the parade, and the smells of delicious food from street vendors fill the air during the 3-day weekend festival. Even though there's some doubt as to whether Columbus was actually Italian, there is no uncertainty in the hearts of Rhode Island's Italian-American community. Columbus was one of their own, and they unabashedly celebrate his discovery of America in 1492 with a great deal of pride. In fact, after a statue of Columbus erected in 1893 in another part of Providence was vandalized and removed this last June, one of the ideas floated for its relocation was to place it somewhere prominent on Federal Hill, but no decision has been made to my knowledge. I suspect local authorities believe it would be safer there, since anyone planning further vandalism would know they would likely be met with local retribution. An effective deterrent, perhaps, though hardly something to be encouraged. These days, we know there were others before Columbus, and even many of the folks on Federal Hill would grudgingly acknowledge the facts. Archaeological evidence and Icelandic folklore, for example, supports an earlier claim of the European exploration of North America by Norse explorers between the year 985 and 1009. There is evidence they attempted to colonize Newfoundland, or Vinland as they called it, but for a variety of reasons, this early colony failed to prosper and faded into history. And there are other speculative theories to excite our imaginations too. Some historians have theorized that an Irish monk, now known as St. Brendan the Navigator, could have reached America sometime around the years 484 to 577, crossing the Atlantic in a primitive curragh, a boat made of wickerwork frame covered in animal hides. But there is very little evidence to support this claim. Another theory suggests that a fleet of Chinese junks under the command of a famous Admiral Zheng discovered the west coast of America in the year 1421. It seems like everyone wants to lay claim to discovering the New World, never mind the fact that there were lots of people already here by any of those dates. And if you want to get technical, all human beings outside of parts of Africa are immigrants. The overwhelming scientific evidence supports the idea that human beings originally came from Africa and spread out across every continent except Antarctica over the course of a few 100,000 years. The ancestors of the first people, or Native Americans, arrived in North America at least 14,000 years ago, and some recent archaeological evidence suggests a much earlier date. It is believed they crossed over a land bridge from Asia during a period of lower sea levels, or possibly could have crossed earlier by traveling along the edge of the great ice sheets from either Asia or Europe. It is also beginning to look like there were successive waves of migration to the Americas over the course of tens of thousands of years. If anyone should be credited with discovering the Americas, it would be some unknown hunter-gatherer. But no matter how they got here, we know the so-called New World was anything but an unpopulated wilderness when the Europeans first arrived. In fact, it is estimated that the native population of the New World at the time of European contact was at least 50 million, and possibly as high as 100 million. It is also likely that several of the great cities of the Aztec Empire and in South America were more populous than the largest European cities when Columbus arrived. The Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, for example, is thought to have been home to more than 200,000 people, roughly 4 times the population of London at the time. But setting aside the question of who can rightfully claim to be first to discover America, nobody can dispute the historical importance of Columbus landing on October 12, 1492, on the island called Guanahani by its native Taino inhabitants. What is more controversial is how we address the complex legacy of issues that his arrival began and that we are still confronting to this day. Just what are we to do with Columbus? Should we really be celebrating Columbus Day at all? Or is it time to either abolish the holiday or to replace it with Indigenous Peoples Day, as many cities and some states have already done? I suggest that it is a more complicated question than some people think. And in light of the current political rhetoric about immigrants and the growing awareness of white privilege raised by Black Lives Matter, I believe it is a good time to address the question in a constructive and honest fashion, though I doubt most Americans will. And let's face it, until recent decades, few people even considered the question. Columbus was seen as a historic discoverer of the New World, who in 1492 sailed the ocean blue with his fleet of 3 tiny ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. School children were taught the mythical story of how he was convinced the earth was round despite popular opinion, and how he persuaded the monarchs of Spain to fund his expedition to prove it. He then set off to the west in hopes of reaching the East Indies, only to accidentally discover America, giving thanks and glory to God. His discovery opened the door for the colonization of America by freedom-loving people like the Pilgrims, who made America into the great nation we are today, with manifest destiny leading the way from the District of Columbia to the Columbia River Gorge. You can almost hear the strains of patriotic music welling up in the background. Glory, glory, hallelujah. It is a compelling national myth for many people, and the idea of even acknowledging the flaws in the story can generate the same kind of fear and anxiety that you see when any sacred story is challenged. It should be no surprise that those who refute the idea of human evolution are often the same people who accuse modern historians of being revisionist or politically correct when they chronicle the harsh realities of European colonization. Nevertheless, the real story that is emerging is quite different from the myth on almost every point. For example, the part about Columbus having a brilliant new idea about the world being round is flat wrong. Many people shared the idea of a round earth going back to the ancient Greeks, and the Greeks had even calculated the circumference of the earth to a fair degree of accuracy. The main reason Columbus could not find backing for his voyage initially had more to do with his bad math. He grossly miscalculated distances between Europe and the Far East, and his error was obvious to many of those he approached. He was stubborn, though, and eventually he got the backing he needed. I could name many other inaccuracies, of course, but the major problem with this story is more troubling. Noticeably absent in the story are the voices of the Taino people who met Columbus on the beach, and the voices of the millions of indigenous people who would suffer or perish in the aftermath of European contact. It is only in recent decades that we are even starting to acknowledge their story. But before I continue, let me add a few words of caution. It is important to revisit the myth, but when we do, I would caution against the temptation to create an anti-myth in its place in our quest for truth and reconciliation. What do I mean by this? We must be wary of applying 21st century ethical ideals to the actions and attitudes of 15th century and subsequent people. And we should also be careful when we assign genocidal motivations or evil intent to the violent confrontations between Europeans and native peoples that history records. History is complicated, to say the least, and it is always a matter of interpretation. My final caution is that we should not allow ourselves to simply lament the past and deny our own culpability in the present. One merely needs to consider the sad state of living conditions on many reservations, the ongoing land disputes between native groups and government agencies, and recent protests such as the water protectors at Standing Rock to know the story is not only in the past. So having said all that, it is undeniable that plenty of brutality, violence, and enslavement came with European contact. It is well documented. Even in the early decades of the 1500s, there were harsh critics of the treatment of native people, such as Father Bartolomé de las Casas, who chronicled the atrocities committed by Europeans, often under the pretense of Christianizing the natives. Torture, disfigurement, and even burning at the stake were common. But without making apologies for their barbarism, we need to keep in mind that the Europeans really didn't know what to make of the New World inhabitants, as our reading today suggests. Were they even human beings, for example? Also, we need to remember that torture, disfigurement, and burning at the stake were not only a fact of life back in the Old World, they were also practiced by native peoples in the Americas. Likewise, critics of Columbus point out that he initiated the Atlantic slave trade by exporting native people as slaves to Spain and later to other islands. But slavery was already a common practice for centuries in the Americas, particularly in Mesoamerica among the Aztecs. Europeans certainly did not introduce violence, warfare, and evil to the Americas, although they are guilty of perpetrating plenty of it. It is probably accurate to accuse Columbus of invading America, or at least of invading those islands in the Caribbean he encountered. And later conquistadors such as Hernando de Cortez and Francisco Pizarro carried it to an even grander scale. All these early explorers were motivated to claim territory and riches in the name of their sovereign and for personal gain, and the subjugation of people for the sake of gaining power and creating new converts to Christianity was highly valued. But again, the conquest of one group over another has been the unfortunate story throughout human history. And it is typically the victors who get to write the story of such conquest, favoring their own perspective. This doesn't mean we should accept the absence of the stories of those who are forgotten. Indeed, it tells us we should always question historical narratives for their inherent biases. But if we accept the idea of Columbus as an invader, I think it is more controversial to describe his actions in the New World as genocide in the strict sense of the word. But some historians have offered strong arguments in recent years. There were later atrocities in American history that were certainly overt examples of genocide, but I'm not convinced his intent was to deliberately exterminate entire groups of native people. We do know that his expeditions were guilty of murdering thousands and working many others to death by forced labor. It is true that most of the native people in the New World were ultimately wiped out after European contact. But most historians agree this was primarily the result of exposure to European diseases rather than violence. It is worth noting, though, that it is hard to determine if deliberate mass murder, famine, and forced labor added together can rival the impact of smallpox and other diseases. But all of these factors certainly contribute to a catastrophic result. Though it is difficult to make an accurate estimate, it is believed that when Columbus arrived on the island he renamed Hispaniola, there were between 300,000 and 3 million native Arawak Taino people living there. By the year 1531, just 39 years later, there were fewer than 600. The mortality rate for European diseases among native populations is believed to have been around 85 to 90%. It was largely a consequence of geographical bad luck and the impact of disease exchange that the impact of disease exchange was so severe and one-sided. Because there were far more animals that had been domesticated in Europe and Africa, and throughout and the knowledge of animal husbandry could more easily be transmitted throughout the old world's east-west geographical orientation, people in the old world came into contact with many diseases that are associated with domesticated livestock, and they developed immunities. This was not the case in the New World because of a more north-south geographical orientation and the lack of animals that had the right characteristics for domestication. To put it bluntly, indigenous peoples in the New World were sitting ducks for the spread of European diseases, and they paid a heavy price. Columbus and the early explorers who came after him had no concept of germs as the cause of disease, and they had no idea they were unleashing such a holocaust on the Americas. By the time the first waves of English colonists began arriving a century later, there were far fewer people waiting to meet them. It was common for these later colonists to encounter abandoned villages and open farmlands, sometimes littered with the skeletal remains of the unburied dead. Disease had all but wiped out many of the eastern tribes they encountered, and the unprecedented social and political upheaval caused by the loss of life had created a very different world than the Spanish encountered. The New World by then was truly closer to the howling wilderness of the Puritan imagination. In addition to the physical impacts of European contact, we must also confront the supplanting of native cultures and religions by European missionaries, no matter how well-intentioned they may have been. Having only recently expelled the Muslim Moors from Spain, there was a great deal of religious zeal associated with the early conquest of the New World. Most Europeans could not recognize anything they would consider to be religion among the native peoples because they could only see through the lens of 15 centuries of Christendom. Indigenous peoples were as spiritual as anyone else, but often their spirituality was intimately associated with the daily practices of living. European missionaries considered native spirituality to be superstitious at best, if not outright demonic, and they often used harsh tactics to stamp it out. But before we condemn Christian missionaries too harshly, let us admit that a few native religious practices were frankly as abhorrent to the Europeans then as they would be to us today. Imagine witnessing Aztecs cutting out the hearts of sacrificial victims to placate the gods so the sun would keep rising, or the sacrifice of young children on mountaintops in the Andes by the Inca. Heretics were still burned at the stake in Europe well after Columbus, but human sacrifice for religious purposes was a distant memory. That said, what constitutes good religion has always been a hotly debated subject. The efforts to subjugate natives and to wipe out their religion were bolstered by the infamous doctrine of discovery, which came from a series of papal edicts issued by the Vatican during the 15th century. According to church authority, Christian explorers were granted the right to claim any lands they discovered in the name of their Christian monarch, so long as the land was not already inhabited by Christians. The doctrine also granted the power to enslave or kill any inhabitants who could not be converted to the Christian faith. It is a topic too complex to speak more about this morning, but you can still hear echoes of the doctrine of discovery in some of the laws we live by today. So having waded through some of the major issues, what are we ready to say about Columbus and his holiday? Are we ready to repudiate Columbus Day in favor of something else? But before we decide, we should consider the fact that the 400th anniversary of the Mayflower's voyage is coming up next month. Are we ready to take a similar critical look at Thanksgiving and the English legacy in America? The brutality of King Philip's War and the infamous Trail of Tears come to mind right off the bat. There are so many layers of history to examine. And as I suggested at the beginning of my sermon, how we celebrate America's heritage should include consideration for other immigrant communities like Italian Americans as well. We must own the whole truth of our legacy, the good, the bad, and the ugly. European Americans have much to be proud about in American history, but we also have a troubled legacy when it comes to our treatment of Native Americans and a long history of denigrating those immigrants who came after our own particular ancestry. Nativism has raised its ugly head many times in American history as waves of Irish, Catholics, Italians, Chinese, Mexicans, and other newcomers have joined our ranks, and it is rampant in the political rhetoric today. I believe the time has come for us to turn the Columbus Day holiday into something different. But I urge everyone to be mindful of all points of view and not rush to simply purge Columbus from history to make ourselves feel better in the present. I strongly support honoring Indigenous peoples with a holiday. They have an incredibly rich heritage from hundreds of unique nations, and we should be eager to learn their stories. As I drove across the country from Rhode Island, I remember thinking about the different native tribes whose ancestral lands I was crossing, from the Narragansetts and the Wampanoag who greeted the Pilgrims, to the Shoshone and Bannock who hunted the Snake River Plain. Maybe we need Indigenous Peoples Day and another holiday that is more inclusive for all Americans, a day to celebrate all of our immigrant stories, from the ancestors of the First Nations, to the waves of Europeans, to those who have only recently arrived in America in search of hope and a better life. We might consider a holiday modeled on one like those in Central and South America that have replaced Columbus Day. For example, Costa Rica's Day of the Encounter of Cultures, or the Day of the Americas, celebrated in Belize. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we had a holiday that became a time of sincere reflection on the past and the present, a time of inspiration for us to do a better job of loving our neighbors, welcoming the stranger, and appreciating the rich tapestry of American history? Thanksgiving might be a good candidate to expand in meaning, but with the religious overtones associated with that holiday, it could be problematic to embrace the true diversity of American culture. How Americans come to terms with the legacy of Columbus will say a lot about us in years to come. The late Native American historian Jack Forbes said that we who are alive today are not responsible for the deeds of our ancestors, but we are responsible for the society we live in, which is a product of the past. The first step to healing the wounds of the past will be to listen and learn, and to recognize the colonial bias in our foundational myth, to teach the whole story of our nation in schools with curricula that includes the stories of Indigenous peoples. We must be honest about the bad and ugly aspects of the story, but willing to celebrate the good, whether it is Indigenous Peoples Day or something else. As Black Elk said, we are a nation of many hoops joined in one circle, and it is indeed holy. I invite you to join in singing our closing hymn, number 318, We Would Be One. Our closing words come from a Sioux prayer in the book Earth Prayers. Grandfather, Great Spirit, all over the world the faces of living ones are alike. With tenderness they have come up out of the ground. Look upon your children that they may face the winds and walk the good road to the day of quiet. Grandfather, Great Spirit, fill us with light. Give us the strength to understand and the eyes to see. Teach us to walk the soft earth as relatives to all that live.
I'll now extinguish our chalice with the following words. If you wish, join me in reciting and reading. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again. Before we play our postlude at the end of the service, I invite you to participate in our virtual coffee hour, which will begin after the postlude. And now we offer a postlude as the end of our service.